I'm a 35-year-old elementary school teacher who spends weekends hunting for treasures at local estate sales and flea markets. There's something magical about finding forgotten items with stories to tell, especially vintage children's books that I can share with my students. One crisp autumn Saturday, I was driving home from the grocery store when a colorful yard sale sign caught my eye. It wasn't on my planned route, but something about the hand-drawn sign with its cheerful letters pulled me in like a magnet. I made a quick decision to follow the arrows down a street into an area I'd never been in before. The yard sale was spread across the lawn of a stately Victorian house that had seen better days. An elderly woman sat in a folding chair beneath a maple tree, watching as a handful of people browsed through her belongings. I wandered through tables of glassware, old clothing, and costume jewelry, nothing particularly calling to me until I spotted a small wooden cabinet tucked beneath a card table. It was about 2 feet tall with a glass door and 3 shelves inside, the kind of display case someone might use for collectibles. The wood was dark cherry with intricate carvings along the top, birds in flight among swirling clouds. I knelt down to examine it more closely, running my fingers over the smooth wood. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and despite a layer of dust, it appeared to be in excellent condition. Opening the glass door, I noticed a small brass key still in the lock. The elderly woman noticed my interest and slowly made her way over. She explained that the cabinet had belonged to her late sister who had collected miniature figurines. When I asked the price, she said $30. I couldn't believe my luck. I'm not an expert, but I'm sure it was worth at least 3 times that amount. After some haggling, I happily handed over $25 and loaded the cabinet into my car. The woman seemed relieved to see it go, mentioning something about making space and letting things move on. The words kind of went in one ear and out the other, and by the time I was in my car, I had forgotten what it was. That evening, I cleaned the cabinet thoroughly, polishing the wood until it gleamed and washing the glass until it sparkled. I placed it in my living room and arranged a few vintage children's book figurines, a pottery bird from Mexico, and a tiny music box from my grandmother inside it. It looked perfect, as if it had always belonged in my home. 3 days later, I returned from school to find a business card tucked into my front door. Martin Keller, Antiques and Appraisals, was printed on one side, and on the back, a handwritten note asking me to call about a recent purchase. I was puzzled. I hadn't mentioned the cabinet to anyone, and the yard sale had been in a neighborhood miles from my own. I decided not to call, tossing the card into my junk drawer. But the next afternoon, as I was grading papers at my kitchen table, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a tall man in his 50s wearing a tweed jacket. When I cautiously opened the door, he introduced himself as Martin Keller, the antiques dealer from the card. He explained that he had been looking for a specific cherry wood display cabinet for a client, and had tracked it to the yard sale I'd attended. He'd spoken to the elderly woman, who'd given him my address after he'd expressed interest in purchasing it for his client. I felt a surge of unease at the realization that a stranger had my address, but his professional demeanor and explanation seemed reasonable. He offered me twice what I'd paid for the cabinet. When I hesitated, mentioning how perfectly it fit in my home, his polite smile tightened almost imperceptibly. He insisted that his client was a serious collector who had been searching for this specific cabinet for years. The more I resisted, the more agitated he became, though he maintained a veneer of professionalism. Eventually, I firmly declined his offer and suggested he look for a similar piece elsewhere. As he left, he warned me that the cabinet might have more history than I realized, and that I should reconsider his generous offer. Something in his tone made me immediately lock the door behind him. That night, I examined the cabinet more closely, wondering what made it so special that someone would track it down. The craftsmanship was beautiful, but nothing seemed extraordinary. As I ran my fingers along the inside, I noticed a small discrepancy in the measurements. The interior depth seemed shorter than the exterior would suggest. After careful examination, I discovered a hidden panel at the back. I pressed against it until it gave way, revealing a narrow compartment. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed with age. The notebook contained handwritten entries dating back to the 1940s, detailing transactions between someone named Edward Keller and various clients. Each entry included amounts, dates, and cryptic codes. Some pages contained names of prominent local families, alongside what appeared to be blackmail information. Affairs, financial misdeeds, even details of covered-up accidents. I realized I was holding a record of decades of extortion. The name Keller connected the dots. Martin must be a relative of Edward, perhaps his son, continuing the family business and desperately wanting to recover this damning evidence. The next morning, I called in sick to school and took the notebook to the local historical society, hoping to get some context without involving the police immediately. The archivist there confirmed my suspicions. Edward Keller had been a well-known photographer who had worked with many wealthy families in the area during the 40s and 50s. When I returned home that afternoon and got out of my car, I froze. My front door stood slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd locked it. Inside, my house had been methodically searched. Drawers were open, books pulled from shelves, even the couch cushions displaced. Nothing seemed to be missing except one thing. The cabinet. It was gone, leaving only a clean rectangle in the dust on my shelf. I immediately called the police, who arrived quickly and went through the regular procedure. They took a report about the break-in and said they would follow up on it. I decided against telling them the significance of the cabinet and what I had discovered, as I wanted to take matters into my own hands. I was fairly certain that it was this Martin Keller who broke in or hired some to do so, to get his hands on the cabinet. Unbeknown to him at the time, I had found the notebook, so the cabinet alone was useless to him. That evening, as I was cleaning up the mess, my phone rang. The caller didn't identify himself, but I recognized Martin Keller's voice immediately. He calmly stated that he had what he wanted, but that the notebook was still missing. If I knew what was good for me, I would leave it in my mailbox overnight and forget everything I'd seen. If not, he knew where I worked, where I shopped, and where my elderly parents lived across town. This guy was making threats towards not only me, but also my family. At first, I thought I could taunt him, and maybe get an extra buck out of it. But this went too far. That night, I checked into a motel and kept the notebook in the room's safe. The next morning, I took it directly to the police station, insisting on speaking with a detective. I explained the full story and showed them the detailed records of blackmail going back decades. The investigation that followed revealed that Martin Keller had been using his father's blackmail records to continue extorting money from the descendants of the original victims. Several families came forward once they realized they were no longer under threat. Keller was eventually arrested a few weeks later. He never followed up on the threats he made to me that day, and to be honest, I'm glad. I do not know what he's capable of. I wasn't planning on finding out. The part of this whole story that I cannot explain to myself is how the cabinet with the notebook ended up at the yard sale of the elderly lady. Unless she was a relative of the family, it makes absolutely no sense that she ended up with it. I tried to contact the lady after everything went down, looking for explanations, but she told me she didn't want to talk about it, and that I should never contact her again. I don't know if she was also threatened by Martin Keller or one of his associates, but I guess I'll never find out. Another thing that puzzles me is how Keller found out that I had the cabinet and knew where I lived. I hadn't provided any contact information at the yard sale, so the only thing I can think of is that I was followed home that day. But then again, why didn't Keller just go and collect the cabinet himself? Maybe the cabinet had some sort of tracking device in it, but then again, I'm sure I would have noticed it. I still go to yard sales every now and then, but this experience has definitely left a mark on me. Most people look at me strangely when I tell them I collect old cameras. But there's something about these vintage things, and it's film, that digital photography will never capture. So when I spotted that worn leather case at the corner yard sale 3 blocks from my apartment, I couldn't resist investigating. The sale was modest at best, just a few folding tables on a small lawn covered with the usual assortment of kitchenware, paperbacks, and children's toys. The elderly couple running it sat in plastic chairs under a nearby tree, keeping cool in the late summer heat. The woman smiled when I approached and started walking towards me. She asked me if there was anything in particular I was looking for, as she watched me scan the tables. I mentioned my interest in old cameras, and she nodded toward a cardboard box beneath one of the tables. That's when I saw the leather case, partially hidden under some outdated electronics. The deep brown leather was cracked with age, but still beautiful, with brass fittings that had developed a rich patina. Inside was a Leica 3 from the late 1930s, remarkably well preserved despite its age. These cameras were valuable, easily worth several $100s to collectors, yet when I asked the price, the woman said, $10. Apparently it was her late brother's who passed away last month, and most of the stuff here is his. Being the good guy that I was, I tried to explain its actual value, but she waved me off, saying she just wanted it gone. I paid her, feeling both thrilled at my find and slightly guilty about the uneven exchange. In my apartment, I carefully inspected the camera. It was in surprisingly good condition, the mechanics still smooth despite decades of disuse. But when I opened the part where you put the roll film in, I noticed that a film was already in it, used, but undeveloped. I was startled for a few moments. What would I possibly find in these photos? I contemplated for a moment if I should just dispose of the film, since it wasn't really any of my business, but my nosiness and excitement to figure out what was on it got the better of me. I operate a small darkroom in my spare bathroom, a hobby within a hobby that allows me complete control over the development process. The process is meditative, but I won't bother you with all the details. As the negatives dried, I felt that familiar anticipation. What moments had been captured but never seen? When I finally examined the negatives under my safety, I was initially disappointed. Most frames were underexposed or blurry, the work of an amateur or someone unfamiliar with the camera's settings. But the final 4 frames were different. The first showed what appeared to be a basement or cellar. Concrete walls and a single bulb casting harsh shadows. Empty except for a wooden chair in the center. Nothing particularly unusual, though something about the composition felt slightly unsettling. The second photo revealed the same basement, this time with someone sitting in the chair. A young woman, her face turned slightly away from the camera, hair falling forward to obscure her profile. Her posture was rigid, uncomfortable. The third photo made my stomach tighten. The same woman, now facing the camera directly. Her expression was difficult to read in the negative, but her body language conveyed obvious distress. Her hands appeared to be behind her back, possibly restrained. The fourth and final photo showed only the empty chair again. I sat in my darkroom for a long time, staring at those negatives. They could be innocuous, perhaps stills from an amateur film project or bizarre art photos. But the progression and the woman's apparent distress suggested something far more disturbing. Sleep evaded me that night. I kept thinking about the woman in the photographs, wondering who she was and what had happened in that basement. By morning, I'd convinced myself I needed to know more about the camera's previous owner. I returned to the yard sale location the next day, but the house was quiet, no sign of the elderly couple. A neighbor was walking her dog nearby, and I asked if she knew when the sale might continue. She told me that it had been a one-day thing, that the couple lives in Florida and only came up to settle Richard's affairs. I explained to her that I purchased a camera with an undeveloped film in it, and that I had found disturbing images on it. The woman clearly had no idea what I was talking about, only that Richard had apparently been quite a collector. I asked if she knew Richard well, and she said not really. He had mainly kept to himself the past 20 years. Then she took a step closer to me and, almost whispering, said that he took early retirement after 3 young girls went missing from a community college where he taught photography. Naturally, he had been one of the suspects, but the police searched his house, found nothing, and he was eventually dismissed. Despite the warm day, I got goosebumps when I heard about the girls. The woman said goodbye and continued walking her dog, leaving me standing there with this new information that I didn't know how to process. Over the next few days, I tried to research Richard Harmon and the disappearances, but found little beyond vague mentions in archived local news. The cases remained unsolved, eventually fading from public attention and running cold like many others. I debated taking the negatives to the police, but what would I say? That I'd developed a decades-old film showing a distressed woman? That it might be connected to unsolved disappearances based on neighborhood gossip? It seemed far-fetched, even to me. Instead, I printed the photographs properly hoping clearer images might reveal more details. Under my enlarger, the photos transformed from ghostly negatives to stark black and white prints. The woman's face became clear, young, early 20s perhaps, with a distinctive mole above her left eyebrow. Her expression in that third photo wasn't just distress, it was undiluted fear. I noticed something else in the full-sized prints. In the corner of the third photograph, partially in shadow, was what appeared to be a small table holding various objects. I used a magnifying glass to study it more closely and identified what looked like photographic chemicals, scissors, and most disturbingly, several locks of hair of different lengths and colors, neatly arranged like specimens. I packaged the negatives and prints carefully, along with a detailed explanation of where I'd acquired the camera and what the neighbor had told me about Richard Harmon. I addressed it to the local police department's cold case unit. Before sealing the envelope, I hesitated, wondering if I was overreacting, seeing sinister implications in what might be completely innocent images. But I couldn't shake the woman's expression, the clinical arrangement of that basement, the trophy-like collection of hair. The next morning, I mailed the package. 3 weeks later, a detective contacted me. They had identified the woman in the photograph as a 22-year-old student who disappeared in 1983 while attending the community college. Based on my information, they obtained a warrant to search Richard Harmon's basement once again. I never found out if they discovered anything new. I guess not, since it's been so many years since the alleged incident, and the basement was completely cleared out from the yard sale. I still visit yard sales occasionally, but now, when I see old cameras or photo albums, I check whether it contains a film. Some images are better left undeveloped. Yard sales had always been my weekend ritual, a simple pleasure that balanced out my high-stress job as a hospital administrator. Every Saturday, I'd drive through different neighborhoods with a travel mug of black coffee, scanning for those telltale signs and colorful balloons. That's how I found myself in the upscale Oak Ridge neighborhood on a crisp autumn morning. It wasn't a typical yard sale of one house, but rather an annual community sale, meaning everyone in the neighborhood could participate. The winding streets were dotted with tables laden with household goods. I'd already picked up a few vintage cookbooks when I spotted a driveway set slightly apart from the others, tucked behind a row of tall hedges. The display was minimal compared to the others, just a few carefully arranged items on a single folding table. Behind the table stood a woman in her early 40s, dressed entirely in black despite the warm weather. Her smile seemed practiced as I approached, her eyes never quite meeting mine as she greeted me. What caught my attention immediately was a wooden jewelry box positioned in the center of the table. It was crafted from dark mahogany with brass fittings and intricate carvings that reminded me of Art Nouveau designs. When I opened it, a ballerina figurine slowly rose and began to turn while a delicate melody played. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, clearly antique and likely valuable. I asked about its price, and I was given a number that was slightly more than I had expected. She explained that it had belonged to her late sister, and she wanted it to find a good home. Something in her voice made me hesitate. A strain, perhaps, or a note of reluctance that seemed at odds with her eagerness to sell. Against my better judgment, I purchased the jewelry box. The woman insisted on having my address to provide the item's history and provenance papers. I rationalized that this made sense for an antique piece, and wrote down my information and didn't think much of it. That evening, I placed the jewelry box on my bedroom dresser. The melody it played was haunting yet beautiful, and I found myself opening it several times just to listen. Before bed, I noticed a small hidden compartment in its base containing a silver locket with a strand of dark hair carefully sealed inside. I assumed it was a Victorian mourning keepsake and added it to my collection of vintage curiosities. 2 days later, I arrived home from work to find a small package on my doorstep. No postage, just my name handwritten on plain brown paper. Inside was a yellow envelope containing photographs of a young woman, presumably from the 1990s, wearing the same locket I'd found in the jewelry box. On the back of one photo was written, "Elizabeth with Mother's Locket, 1994. This unsolicited delivery left me unsettled. I knew that the envelope was from the lady whom I purchased the jewelry box from, but I had expected to receive some official document, not a photograph of a woman. The next morning, I noticed a gray sedan parked across from my house when I left for work. When I returned that evening, a similar vehicle was parked 2 houses down. I might not have connected the two, if not for the distinctive bumper sticker of a local art museum. The same one I'd noticed on the woman's vehicle at the yard sale. Over the next few days, the car appeared regularly, always at a distance, but always within sight of my home. Sometimes I caught glimpses of someone sitting inside, but the windows were tinted, making it difficult to confirm my suspicions. A week after purchasing the jewelry box, I arrived home to find my mailbox open and a small bouquet of black dahlias placed inside. There was no card, no explanation. I looked around to see if the gray sedan was somewhere to be seen, but I couldn't spot it. A cold weight settled in my stomach as I hurried inside and locked the door behind me. That night, it must have been around 2 a.m., when I was awoken by the sound of the jewelry box's melody. I looked away and almost screamed when I saw the silhouette of a woman standing in my darkened bedroom doorway. My heart hammered against my ribs as I fumbled for the lamp switch. When light flooded the room, no one was there, but the jewelry box was open, its ballerina turning slowly. I was certain I'd closed it before going to bed. The next day, I left work early and drove straight to the police station. The officer listened patiently as I explained about the woman, the car, the photographs, and the flowers. He took notes, but explained that without explicit threats or evidence of trespassing, there wasn't much to be done. He suggested installing security cameras and documenting any further incidents. I installed a video doorbell that same afternoon. That evening, it captured the woman from the yard sale standing motionless on my front steps for nearly 5 minutes before leaving another envelope and walking away. This time, the envelope contained a newspaper clipping about the death of Elizabeth Kerr, age 26, who had committed suicide in 1994. The article mentioned she was survived by her sister, Marion. The next morning, I called in sick to work and researched Elizabeth Kerr's death. Local news archives revealed more details. Elizabeth had been found in her apartment after taking an overdose of sleeping pills. The jewelry box with its ballerina had been playing when her body was discovered. As I pieced together the story, my doorbell camera sent an alert to my phone. The woman from the yard sale was back, this time trying the handle of my front door. I called the police immediately, watching through the app as she circled my house, peering through windows. She disappeared from view and seemed to be heading toward the back of the house. When the police arrived minutes later, they didn't find anybody. I gave the police the address of the woman, and they followed up on her. I learned the woman was actually Marion Kerr, the sister of Elizabeth Kerr. She had spent years in and out of psychiatric facilities. She would sell the jewelry box and the locket to unsuspecting people, then reclaim it once she determined they were unworthy of her sister's possession. Sometimes this reclamation was peaceful. Other times, it wasn't. The police officer explained that I was the 14th person to report incidents with Marion and the jewelry box in the past decade. I gave the police the jewelry box and the locket and told them they should give it back to her. I also filed for a restraining order, should Marion ever try to get close to me again. It's been a few years since these events, and I'm living in a new neighborhood across town now. Occasionally, I still visit yard sales, although not as frequently as I used to. I've installed an extensive security system and rarely bring home anything that might have history attached to it. I never ever saw Marion again. Honestly, people like that shouldn't be living alone. I just hope she hasn't physically hurt anybody.